Welcome to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian, a place where history is not rushed, not shouted, but whispered slowly, like a candle flickering in the quiet of night. Here, we journey through the calm history of the world's most extraordinary moments, plagues that reshaped empires, forgotten naval disasters, medieval rituals, ancient whispers, and the quiet lives of people who once shaped the course of time. This is not the loud history of battles and trumpets. It is the gentle echo of stories meant for rest, reflection, and drifting into sleep. So, close your eyes, and let the slow tide of history carry you, through empires that rose and fell, through plagues that humbled kings, through forgotten legends told under torchlight. History told calmly. Stories told for sleep. You are listening to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian. The whisper before the storm. History remembers battles by their noise, swords clashing, trumpets calling, cannons shaking the earth. But plagues never announce themselves so loudly. They arrive softly, like a whisper slipping beneath a door, or a cough breaking the stillness of a night. The first sign was never a grand event. Sometimes it was just one man leaning against the market wall, too tired to lift his basket. Or a child left behind on the road because her legs refused to carry her. Traders on the Silk Road might pause at the sight of a companion sweating in the cool desert air. Sailors on a galley might hear the soft groan of a man below deck, curled against the planks, his skin hot to the touch. Empires were built on trade, movement, and ambition. Caravans carried spices and silk, but they also carried things unseen. Ships carried soldiers and silver, but they also carried the small, hidden passengers that slipped into rats and fleas, or nestled in the lungs of the weary. And when these unseen riders arrived in cities, they reshaped the world more profoundly than any sword. Plagues had no generals, no banners, no music of war. Yet they conquered kings, toppled armies, and silenced entire streets. They did not roar into history. They drifted, calm and patient, until even the mightiest throne grew unsteady beneath their weight. This is the story of plagues that reshaped empires. Not with fire and steel, but with silence, absence, and the slow unraveling of life itself. The first shadows in ancient worlds. Long before the medieval world's famous plagues, ancient empires felt the tremors of unseen illnesses. The Athenian plague during the Peloponnesian War in 430 BC struck like a shadow falling across a proud city. Thucydides, who lived through it, wrote not with fevered panic but with a kind of weary resignation. He described fevers, thirst, and a sense of despair that seemed to spread faster than the sickness itself. Athens had been a city of ambition, raising marble temples, debating democracy, sending fleets across the sea. Yet all it took was one ship from Egypt or Libya, one spark of contagion carried unknowingly across the Mediterranean, and suddenly the city that dreamed of ruling Greece was brought to its knees. What is striking in such moments is not only the deaths themselves but the quiet unraveling of order. Rituals fell silent. Funeral customs collapsed as the dead outnumbered the living who could bury them. Neighbors ceased to visit neighbors. And in the stillness of fear, Athens lost more than soldiers, it lost its spirit. Elsewhere, Rome too would one day face this same invisible conqueror. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century spread with the legions, returning home not only with spoils of war but with sickness that respected no rank. Soldiers fell as swiftly as farmers. Emperors themselves coughed and grew pale. The calm of empire, its marble, its mosaics, its confident roads, hid the fact that everything rested upon fragile bodies. And bodies, when claimed by plague, left even the strongest empire shivering in its silence. The Antonine Plague and Rome's shaken foundations. In the 2nd century of our era, Rome appeared unshakable. Its legions marched from Britain to Mesopotamia, its roads tied the empire together like veins, and its emperors styled themselves as masters of the world. Yet in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a quiet enemy entered, small, unseen, born perhaps on the breath of a merchant, or the sweat of a soldier returning from war. The Antonine Plague, thought by many to be smallpox, began in the eastern provinces and drifted westward with the patience that only disease possesses. It did not storm the walls of Rome with catapults or battering rams. Instead, it walked in unnoticed, multiplying in lungs, lingering on the surfaces of amphorae and clothes. Contemporary accounts speak of pustules and fevers, of exhaustion that emptied the mighty legions. Entire cohorts withered, unable to lift a shield, their camps transformed into fields of moaning and silence. In cities, shop stalls closed, theaters grew empty, and funeral pyres smoked day and night. Rome did not collapse in that moment, but it staggered. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, wrote his meditations during this time, as if clinging to the thought that while flesh faltered, reason might endure. His words carried the weight of a man who ruled an empire of millions yet could not command the sickness that drained them. The empire survived, but changed. Recruitment for the army grew desperate. Economic strain deepened. Faith, too, shifted. People sought comfort not only in Rome's old gods but in new ones who promised protection from invisible foes. The plague did not conquer Rome outright, but it whispered a truth: empires are not toppled only by swords. Sometimes, a cough in a crowded street does more to bend the arc of history than 1,000 spears. The Cyprian Plague and the collapse of daily life. A century after the Antonine Plague faded, another shadow arrived. This one history remembers as the Plague of Cyprian, named not for its origin, but for the bishop of Carthage who described its horrors. Around the year 249 C, it spread like a hushed rumor that grew into a roar, leaving devastation across the empire already weakened by internal strife. Cyprian's writings are not the cool notations of a physician but the trembling testimony of a witness. He described throats that swelled until breath became a desperate struggle, bowels that loosened without mercy, eyes inflamed until sight itself dimmed. The body unraveled piece by piece, and death followed with terrible consistency. What makes this plague stand out is not only the illness, but its timing. Rome was already battered by political instability, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession. Civil wars thinned the armies, invasions pressed at the borders. Into this fragile order came disease, and daily life itself collapsed. Harvests rotted in the fields when farmers grew too sick to gather them. Markets emptied, not because goods were gone, but because the living feared to brush against the dying. Whole families disappeared from their homes. Neighbors barred doors against one another. In the cities, the silence of abandoned streets became as oppressive as the cries of the ill. Yet Cyprian also noted something else. Amid despair, the Christian communities, still small and often persecuted, cared for the sick when others turned away. They nursed the afflicted, buried the dead with dignity, and earned a reputation for compassion that would linger in memory long after the epidemic passed. The empire survived again, but weaker than before. Armies that once marched in disciplined ranks were scattered by both sickness and neglect. Economies contracted, trust eroded, and a sense began to stir. Perhaps Rome was no longer eternal. Perhaps no empire was. The Justinianic plague and the empire that shivered. In the spring of 541 C, in the bustling port city of Pelusium in Egypt, whispers began of a sickness that did not behave like any before. Ships carried grain up from the Nile Delta, and with them came rats. Within their fur hid fleas, and within those fleas lurked the bacterium that modern science calls Yersinia pestis. In time, the world would know its name, the plague. When it reached Constantinople in 542, the Byzantine Empire's heart shuddered. Emperor Justinian, whose vision of restoring Rome's glory had already seen great victories and architectural triumphs, suddenly found his capital transformed into a city of mourning. Contemporary chroniclers speak with awe and terror of the scale. Some claimed that 10,000 died in a single day. Others wrote that so many corpses filled the streets that burial became impossible, and bodies were stacked in towers or heaved into the sea. The symptoms were unmistakable and swift. Swellings, or buboes, appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck, tender to the touch, blackened with rot. Fever seized the body, delirium overtook the mind, and within days, death claimed the majority. Those who survived often bore scars or a frailty that followed them for life. The plague did not end in a season. It lingered, returning again and again over 2 centuries, a ghostly tide washing through provinces from North Africa to Gaul. Each resurgence thinned populations, broke supply chains, and left once prosperous regions barren of labor. For Justinian, the timing was disastrous. His armies, stretched thin in Italy and beyond, struggled to replenish their numbers. Tax revenues collapsed. Dreams of restoring the Western Roman Empire were choked not by sword or rebellion, but by the invisible hand of pestilence. Even the emperor himself fell ill. Though he recovered, his survival was seen as near miraculous. The plague reshaped Byzantium in ways no enemy could. Lands emptied, villages withered, and faith in human endurance faltered. The empire continued, but a different one, more cautious, less ambitious, its glory tempered by the memory of countless funeral pyres. When war and pestilence marched together. The history of empire is often told in the clash of armies, the banners, the shields, the cries of men on the battlefield. Yet time and again, plagues marched in lockstep with soldiers, invisible companions that determined victories and defeats far more decisively than swords. Consider the campaigns of the Byzantine armies during the age of Justinian. His legions, carrying the imperial eagle westward, often found themselves less threatened by Gothic warriors than by sickness creeping through their ranks. Marching on foreign soil meant exposure to foreign water, foreign climates, and the vermin that thrived in camps. A single infected rat, smuggled aboard a supply wagon, could undo the work of 1,000 spears. This pattern repeated itself across ages. Centuries later, during the Mongol expansions, plague became both weapon and accident. Chronicles speak of sieges where disease erupted inside a besieged city, weakening defenders before the gates ever fell. In one grim tale from the Black Sea, corpses of plague victims were said to be flung over city walls by catapult, a mingling of warcraft and pestilence that blurred the line between battle and contagion. For soldiers, the experience was bewildering. They could brace against an enemy charge, they could fortify walls, but they could not defend against a fever that bloomed overnight, or a swelling that signaled certain death. Officers spoke of entire cohorts vanishing in weeks, not from enemy arrows, but from unseen breath passed through the ranks. The consequence was more than military. Kingdoms planning expansion campaigns found themselves forced into retreat, not because their kings lost their nerve, but because the peasantry had been thinned, the supply trains broken, the very fabric of society too fragile to sustain conquest. Thus, plagues became hidden generals in the wars of empires. They commanded without heraldry, conquered without armies, and left behind no monuments, only silence where once there had been nations. The Black Death and the strange rebirth of Europe. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it carried away nearly half of the continent's people. Fields went untilled, churches stood half empty, and villages vanished from the map entirely. But what followed this devastation was a paradox. Out of ruin came transformation. The survivors found themselves living in a world where labor was suddenly precious. A plowman who had once begged for a crust of bread could now demand higher wages, for there were too few hands to harvest the fields. Lords who had ruled unchallenged found their power slipping, not because of rebellion, but because scarcity gave commoners leverage. Serfs deserted their manors, seeking better terms elsewhere, and feudal bonds loosened like old knots unraveling. Religion, too, trembled. Priests had preached that the plague was God's punishment, yet holy men perished alongside sinners, and prayers seemed to carry little protection. In this confusion, some turned toward mysticism and wandering preachers, while others looked skeptically at the old authorities. Quietly, the seeds of reform were planted in this soil of disillusionment. Even art and imagination bent beneath the weight of pestilence. Painters filled their canvases with skeletal dancers leading kings and beggars alike to the grave, the macabre dance macabre that reminded viewers of mortality's equality. Writers, too, found new voices, from Boccaccio's tales told by plague survivors in Florence to rustic ballads sung in villages about empty streets and vanished neighbors. And yet, from this shadowed time came renewal. With land abandoned, forests crept back across Europe, filling clearings with deer and wildflowers. With fewer mouths to feed, diets improved for those who remained, and famine loosened its grip. In towns, merchants grew stronger, trading cloth, spices, and knowledge, while universities swelled with scholars seeking answers beyond prayer. The Black Death was a wound upon the world, yet out of its scar came a strange vitality, a shift in power, in thought, in culture. It was as though Europe, though hollowed by grief, found itself pushed toward a new age, one that would eventually give rise to Renaissance light after centuries of shadow. Pestilence in the Ottoman world. While Europe reeled beneath the weight of the Black Death, the Ottoman lands too felt the slow, steady bite of plague. The empire, vast and stretching across 3 continents, was stitched together by roads, ports, and bustling markets. Yet those same arteries that carried wealth and knowledge also carried contagion. In Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, the city's crowded quarters bore the brunt. Ships arriving from Alexandria or the Levant brought more than spices and silks. They carried rats hidden in their holds, fleas clinging unseen. Outbreaks returned like unwelcome guests, not once but again and again, haunting the capital for centuries. Each wave altered the rhythm of life. The streets would empty, shops would shutter, and the faithful filled mosques in desperate prayer, believing that destiny, written already by Allah, could not be evaded. The Ottomans responded with a mixture of resignation and ingenuity. Quarantine stations appeared along ports, though resistance to them was strong, for merchants feared the loss of profit more than disease. Doctors, steeped in Greco-Arabic medicine, prescribed balancing humors, scented fumigations, and protective amulets. Yet the plague moved with a will of its own, indifferent to talismans or theories. What is striking is how the empire absorbed these blows without crumbling. Unlike Europe, where plague shattered feudal bonds, in the Ottoman lands society leaned upon its faith and traditions. The Sultan himself was seen as God's shadow on earth, and so long as he ruled, order felt preserved, even in the midst of loss. The belief in divine decree allowed the people to endure tragedy with a patience that puzzled European visitors. Still, the empire was reshaped in quieter ways. Cities declined in spurts, pushing some families to rural villages. Trade routes shifted, as certain ports gained advantage when others were struck. Scholars, watching death repeat itself in cycles, began compiling plague treatises, catalogues of symptoms, cures, and histories, part science, part devotion. These works would echo into later centuries, preserved in libraries where time itself seemed to stand still. For the Ottomans, plague was not a single cataclysm, but a recurring tide, an unwanted rhythm woven into the empire's long life. And through endurance, the empire showed that resilience can take many forms, not always rebellion or reform, but sometimes a calm acceptance, a waiting for the storm to pass. Plague across the Indian Ocean. Far from the courts of Europe and the palaces of the Ottomans, the Indian subcontinent stood as the beating heart of trade. Ports such as Calicut, Cambay, and Cochin bustled with merchants from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and China. Ships carried pepper, cardamom, and cotton, their sails swelling with monsoon winds. But just as the sea brought riches, it also brought ruin. Plague, cholera, and other unnamed fevers flowed in through harbors like shadow cargo. The cities of Gujarat, so proud in their wealth, faced sudden silences as sailors disembarked carrying more than spices. Sometimes the disease spread inland with caravans, winding up the Ganges plain, finding villages where doctors mixed herbs, prayed to deities, and performed rituals of cleansing. In India, religion gave shape to the response. Temples became places of both refuge and fear. In some regions, processions were carried through streets with idols lifted high, offerings of ghee lamps and incense filling the smoky air. People believed that angry gods or restless spirits were the cause, and so they sought to appease them with chants, fasts, or the sacrifice of animals. In other places, Islam's presence gave a different lens. Disease was seen as part of Qadr, divine will, not to be resisted but endured with patience. The Mughal emperors, at their height, kept physicians who blended Unani medicine with local traditions. Remedies of rosewater, musk, and camphor were prescribed alongside purgatives and cooling diets. Quarantine, however, rarely took hold, for the movement of trade was lifeblood, and to stop ships was to starve cities. And so outbreaks ebbed and flowed, each one trimming populations yet never halting the vast rhythm of India's markets. What is notable is that the empire did not collapse under plague's weight. Instead, patterns shifted. Certain ports lost prominence when considered unlucky by sailors, while others rose quietly. Rural areas absorbed urban refugees, creating new agricultural settlements. Famine sometimes followed disease, as fields went untended. Yet out of this came resilience. Communities adapted by diversifying crops, tightening kinship bonds, and weaving new rituals of remembrance. The Indian Ocean carried not only goods and illness but also ideas. Reports of plague in one kingdom rippled across the seas, warning another port before the ships arrived. In this way, networks of information, half rumor, half truth, were born, a proto-global awareness that plague itself had forced into being. And so in India and its seaborne trade world, pestilence became not just an ending, but a quiet reweaver of patterns, redirecting trade winds of history as surely as the monsoon itself. Plague and the Mandate of Heaven in China. In the great river valleys of China, where dynasties rose and fell with the rhythm of the Yellow and Yangtze, plague was more than illness, it was a sign. According to ancient belief, the mandate of heaven could be withdrawn if rulers failed in their duty. Earthquakes, floods, famine, and epidemics were not merely natural events, they were evidence that heaven itself was displeased. Records from the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties mention waves of sickness that thinned armies and emptied villages. At times the descriptions are vague. A heat illness, or a pestilence that carried men away like smoke. At other times the detail is stark, carbuncles that blacken the skin, coughs that drown the breath, fevers that left the body cold within days. We can only guess now whether these were smallpox, plague, cholera, or influenza. But their effects were always clear. During the Tang dynasty, entire garrisons along the Silk Road fell ill, leaving borderlands exposed. Traders from Central Asia brought silk, jade, and horses, but also sickness carried in their blood. Outbreaks in the capital of Chang'an forced the suspension of examinations, delaying the careers of scholar officials and weakening the machinery of government. In rural areas, Buddhist monasteries became places of care, offering not only medicine but prayers and rituals for the dead. The Yuan dynasty, under Mongol rule, witnessed one of the most catastrophic encounters, the Black Death itself. Originating somewhere in the steppes or oases of Central Asia, it spread eastward as much as westward, devastating northern Chinese provinces. The death toll was staggering. Farmers abandoned their fields, canals silted up, and famine followed pestilence. Rebels whispered that the Mongols had lost heaven's favor. Soon uprisings erupted, paving the way for the Ming to rise. What is striking is that the memory of plague was woven into philosophy. Confucian scholars debated whether disease arose from moral failings of rulers or from imbalance in the natural order. Taoists prescribed breathing exercises, elixirs, and talismans, seeking to align the body with cosmic harmony. Meanwhile, common folk hung charms of peachwood over their doors, burned herbs, or consulted traveling healers who promised to drive away demons of sickness with chants and drums. China's response was not only spiritual. Practical measures existed too. Officials sometimes ordered the burning of infected clothing, or the isolation of villages behind makeshift barricades. Yet the scale of trade along the Grand Canal and the Silk Road meant that containment rarely lasted long. Disease rode with caravans, just as it later rode with ships. Dynasties endured, but they endured transformed. Epidemics reminded both rulers and ruled of the fragility of power. The mandate of heaven was not an abstract idea when pestilence swept through the land. It was a felt reality, an explanation for why even the strongest armies and grandest palaces could not stand against an invisible enemy. Thus, in China, plague reshaped more than demography. It reshaped legitimacy itself, teaching each dynasty that their right to rule was as mortal as the bodies of their subjects. Plague on the islands of Japan. When we cross the sea to Japan, the story of plague takes on a quieter, more insular character. Japan's geography, a chain of islands set apart from the Asian mainland, offered a kind of natural barrier. Yet even barriers falter when ships arrive, carrying not only silks and scrolls from China and Korea but also the invisible seeds of disease. One of the earliest great epidemics recorded was smallpox in the 8th century, during the reign of Emperor Shoma. The chronicles speak of villages emptied, of officials unable to perform their duties, and of tax revenues collapsing as farmers died or fled. It was said that nearly 1/3 of the population perished in that single outbreak. For a nation still in the process of building its imperial institutions, the loss was devastating. The emperor, desperate, turned not only to physicians but to the realm of faith. Buddhism, newly arrived from the continent, gained sudden prominence as a response to plague. Emperor Shoma commissioned the building of the great Buddha at Todaiji in Nara, a monumental figure in bronze, cast in part as an act of merit to ward off further catastrophe. The towering statue was both a prayer and a proclamation that even in the face of invisible death, the empire would seek cosmic harmony. Later centuries brought their own scourges. Smallpox recurred with wearying regularity, shaping demographics and leaving survivors marked with scars. Leprosy spread quietly along roads and villages, creating communities of the afflicted who lived on society's edges, often supported by alms. Influenza-like illnesses, described in Heian diaries, swept through the court, disrupting poetry contests and ceremonies alike. Even emperors were not spared. Yet the Japanese response often took on a deeply ritual quality. Shinto shrines organized purification ceremonies. Buddhist monks carried out rites of chanting sutras over the sick. Amulets, incense, and pilgrimages were part of the cure as much as herbs and decoctions. The line between medicine and magic was porous, and perhaps comfort lay as much in ritual as in remedy. In the medieval era, when civil wars fractured the land, epidemics sometimes accomplished what armies could not. Samurai chronicles tell of battles interrupted by sudden fevers that swept through camps, forcing truces or retreats. Disease was an unseen warrior, impartial and inexhaustible, reminding even the strongest that life was fragile. What is remarkable is that out of these repeated encounters with illness, Japan developed both resilience and reverence. Shrines to epidemic gods were established, prayers were woven into festivals, and literature recorded the sorrows of families broken by pestilence. Even in the stillness of haiku, we find the shadow of plague, the fleeting nature of life, the awareness that existence is but a passing season. Plague in Japan never annihilated empires as it did elsewhere, but it carved itself into the cultural memory, whispering that even on islands ringed by sea, the world's sufferings could not be kept entirely away. The Abbasid Caliphate and the Plague's Quiet March. In the Abbasid Caliphate, where Baghdad rose like a jewel of learning and trade, Plague was an uninvited guest that often slipped quietly into its bustling markets. The caliphs presided over an empire stretching across deserts, rivers, and fertile lands, yet even their scholars and physicians could not bar the doors against illness that rode along caravans and ships. Epidemics arrived in waves, sometimes described in chronicles with chilling brevity. The year was marked by great mortality. The harvest failed, and people died in their thousands. Though not always named as the Black Death, the bubonic plague and its cousins appeared intermittently, spreading from the Mediterranean trade routes or from Persia into the heartlands of Islam. In Baghdad itself, plague struck hardest when the city was already weary, after floods, famines, or wars. It was often the poor, crowded into narrow alleys, who suffered most. Yet even the elites felt its hand. Viziers, poets, and soldiers alike could vanish within a few days of fever. It was said that at times the cemeteries of Baghdad filled so quickly that prayers were shortened simply to keep pace with the dead. But the Abbasid response was unique. Scholars, inheritors of Greek medicine and innovators of their own, sought to understand disease through observation as much as through ritual. Physicians such as Al-Razi and Ibn Sina pondered contagion, air quality, and the balance of humors. Ventilation, fumigation with herbs, and careful diets were prescribed, alongside Quranic recitations and invocations of God's mercy. To them, plague was both a physical affliction and a test of faith. Trade, however, could not stop. Caravans continued to cross the deserts, ships still sailed from Basra and Aden, and pilgrims journeyed to Mecca. Each movement was a thread, carrying not just silks, spices, and knowledge but also the hidden presence of disease. The Hajj in particular posed unique challenges. Pilgrims often fell ill in crowded camps, their journeys shortened by fever. Some historians note that in certain years, whole groups never returned, their absence a silent testament to the cost of devotion in plague years. Yet out of suffering, culture endured. Poets of the Abbasid court, ever alert to the fragility of life, laced their verses with reflections on mortality. Roses that wilted, nights that slipped away, lives as fleeting as breath. Mosques, hospitals, and charitable endowments were strengthened, for in times of plague, charity was seen as a shield against God's wrath. The act of giving, of bread, medicine, or coin, was itself a remedy for the soul. And so the Abbasid Caliphate, like so many empires, found that plagues did not topple its libraries or erase its learning. Instead, they deepened the awareness that beneath the grandeur of palaces and the wisdom of scholars, humanity remained vulnerable, its fate written in both stars and microbes unseen. The Mongols and the Black Horsemen on the steppe. When the Mongol Empire thundered across the steppes, it seemed as though no barrier could halt their momentum. Armies that moved like storms, couriers that crossed continents in weeks, and trade that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Mediterranean. This was the empire of Khans. Yet even they carried, unknowingly, a quieter conqueror in their saddlebags, plague. The Mongols built what historians call the Pax Mongolica, a period of astonishing connectivity. Caravans, merchants, envoys, and scholars flowed across Eurasia under Mongol protection. Silk, paper, gunpowder, and ideas moved faster than ever before. But so too did the invisible passengers hiding among fleas and rodents. In time, the very arteries of empire that brought wealth also carried disease. One of the most infamous moments came during the siege of Kaffa in 1346, a Genoese trading outpost on the Crimean coast. When plague swept through the Mongol besiegers, chronicles claimed they hurled the infected corpses over the city walls, an act often described as an early form of biological warfare. Whether or not this gruesome tale unfolded exactly as written, the truth is that ships sailing from Kaffa soon carried plague westward into the Mediterranean, setting in motion the devastation of Europe's Black Death. For the Mongols themselves, plague was a double-edged fate. It thinned armies, sometimes halting campaigns. It traveled the same routes as tribute and trade, seeping into steppe encampments and cities alike. Chronicles tell of sudden mortality in caravan towns, whole communities emptied overnight. Horses, too, were not always spared, and the loss of livestock struck at the very heart of Mongol strength. Yet the empire endured in its way. The Khans, heirs to a tradition of pragmatism, did not see plague as a conqueror to be fought but as part of the unpredictable steppe world, like winter blizzards or drought. Shamanic rituals were performed, prayers were offered, but the horsemen rode on, as they always had. Still, whispers of divine punishment traveled with the winds. For some, the pestilence was heaven's verdict on conquest and bloodshed. Perhaps the greatest irony was that the Mongols, who unified continents, also helped unify humanity in suffering. A merchant leaving China could unknowingly carry a threat of infection that would, within a few years, shape the fate of peasants in France, monks in England, and nobles in Italy. The Mongol highways did not just carry goods and ideas. They carried a pandemic that reshaped half the known world. And so, in the empire of the horse lords, plague was less a single storm than a constant shadow, following caravans across the endless plains, a reminder that even the swiftest rider could not outrun death. China's dynasties and the quiet cracks of plague. In China, the cycles of dynasty had always risen and fallen like tides. Floods, droughts, rebellions, and celestial omens were seen as signs that the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, was shifting. When plague entered this ancient rhythm, it was not seen merely as sickness but as evidence that heaven had turned its face. The Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols, presided over a vast, multi-ethnic empire. At its height, the Yuan rulers controlled not only the steppes but also the fertile heartlands of China. Yet plague seeped into their reign like water into the cracks of stone. Reports from the 14th century speak of villages where 9 in 10 households perished, markets that fell silent, and tax records that vanished because there were no survivors left to pay them. For the common people, life shrank into stillness. The rice paddies that had shimmered with workers stood empty, overgrown with weeds. City streets became haunted by silence, broken only by the carts of the dead. Families lit incense and prayed before household shrines, appealing to gods and ancestors, but the air was thick with fear that heaven itself had passed judgment on the empire. The plague was not only biological, it was political. As famine and disease tightened their grip, rebellions smoldered. Secret societies whispered of restoring native Chinese rule, blaming the foreign Mongol rulers for losing heaven's favor. The Red Turban Rebellion rose from this soil of despair, a movement fueled as much by hunger and plague as by ideology. Out of these turbulent years would eventually come the Ming dynasty, born not merely of swords but of pestilence that undermined Mongol power. Even for survivors, the scars lingered. Chinese physicians documented symptoms with meticulous detail: swellings in the groin and armpits, fevers that burned like fire, death within 3 days of onset. Some doctors prescribed herbs, fumigations, or talismans, others advised flight. But the plague moved faster than knowledge could contain it. What stands out in these chronicles is not only despair but resilience. Families restructured, villages regrouped, and rituals adapted. New prayers were written, new rites devised to honor the countless unburied. Out of catastrophe came the quiet endurance that would allow dynasties to fall and new ones to rise, always under the watchful eye of heaven. Thus, in China, plague was not merely a disease but a participant in history. It helped topple dynasties, reshaped political landscapes, and reminded emperors and peasants alike that no power, be it Mongol cavalry or imperial decree, could command the silence of death. Byzantium and the long shadow of Justinian's plague. Long before the Black Death stalked Europe, another empire had already felt the weight of plague. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire, proud heir of Rome, was ruled by Emperor Justinian I, a man determined to restore the old Roman glory. His armies reconquered Italy, parts of North Africa, and even pressed into Spain. It seemed the empire might rise anew, crowned by the golden domes of Constantinople. And then the plague came. It began quietly in 541 CE, arriving on ships that carried grain from Egypt. Rats and their fleas disembarked in the busy harbors of Constantinople, unseen but deadly. Soon, the city of 500,000 people was gripped by terror. Procopius, the historian of the court, wrote that the bodies of the dead were too many to be counted. At the peak, 10,000 people were said to die each day. The silence that followed was not peaceful but eerie. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, their doors sealed, their windows dark. Barges piled with corpses floated out to sea, only to drift back to shore, bloated with death. Justinian himself fell ill but survived. Many whispered it was proof of divine favor. Others wondered why, if God supported him, he had allowed so much ruin. The plague did not end quickly. It returned in waves for 2 centuries, each recurrence cutting into the empire's strength. Fields went untilled, tax revenues collapsed, and armies shrank not from defeat but from disease. Territories Justinian had fought so hard to reclaim slipped away, as Byzantine governors lacked the men and resources to hold them. More than borders were lost. Faith itself trembled. In Constantinople's churches, incense hung heavy in the air as priests chanted prayers to saints, but outside the church walls, rumors spread of demons carrying the pestilence through the streets at night. Some people turned to prayer, others to despair, others still to wild revelry, believing the world was ending. The Byzantines had lived in the shadow of Rome, determined to preserve its law, its grandeur, its legacy. Yet the plague proved stronger than ambition. By the time the waves of pestilence receded, the empire was smaller, poorer, and weary. When later enemies pressed against its borders, the Arabs, the Bulgars, the Normans, the Byzantines faced them not as the empire that Justinian had imagined, but as one already hollowed out by silence and loss. Thus, centuries before the Black Death, plague had already reshaped the heirs of Rome, ensuring that even the mightiest walls of Constantinople could not keep out death. Plague in the Islamic world, faith, law, and destiny. When the Black Death swept across the lands of Islam in the 14th century, it found a world of scholars, merchants, and cities already bound together by trade routes and pilgrimage roads. From Cairo to Damascus, from Baghdad to Mecca, the plague struck not in silence, but in a world deeply attentive to faith and fate. In the Quran itself, no passage directly speaks of plague, yet traditions soon grew around it. The sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, the Hadith, were carefully remembered. If you hear of a plague in a land, do not enter it. If it occurs where you are, do not leave it. This became not only spiritual guidance but an early form of quarantine. But law and faith sat uneasily with fear. Some scholars argued that plague was a martyr's gift. Those who died in it were blessed as if they had fallen in battle. Others said it was a punishment for sin, a divine warning to return to righteousness. This duality left people torn between resignation and dread. To endure meant salvation, but to flee meant survival. In Cairo, the great metropolis of the Mamluk sultans, records tell of funerals stretching for miles. Chroniclers wrote of entire quarters emptied, of markets silenced, of camels wandering masterless. Yet still, the call to prayer rose from the minarets, 5 times each day, as though to remind the living that even in the shadow of death, the order of the world remained. Damascus too suffered, its famed gardens overgrown, its fountains quiet, its scholars penning somber commentaries on the meaning of calamity. Ibn Khaldun, the great philosopher of history, lost both his parents to plague in Tunis. He later wrote that the epidemic devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. For him, plague was not only a disaster of bodies but of history itself, a reset upon which new empires would rise. Yet in the midst of this, pilgrims still journeyed to Mecca. Caravans shrank in number, but they did not cease. Some came believing that to die on the holy road was a blessing. Others came in desperation, hoping that the sacred city might be spared. Even there, however, the plague crept in, carried by breath and by silence, reminding all that no place on earth was immune. For the Islamic world, plague was not only a test of survival but a profound meditation on destiny. Cities rose again, trade resumed, empires shifted, but the memory of those waves lingered in poetry, in sermons, in the rhythm of prayer. Plague had become part of the story of faith itself, not only the end of lives, but the shaping of belief. Plague across India and Central Asia, caravans in silence. The overland roads of Central Asia, stitched together by the Silk Route, were not only highways of silk and spice, but also of silence, for they bore the weight of plague upon their dust. Caravans that once rang with bells and laughter found themselves moving with caution, as rumors of sickness at distant oases spread faster than camels could carry their loads. In India, the records are scattered, but hints remain. Chronicles of the Delhi Sultanate speak of years when famine and pestilence arrived hand in hand. Crops failed, and with hunger came weakness. With weakness came the creeping hand of disease. Entire villages were abandoned, their wells filling with leaves and dust. Temples and mosques alike became places of mourning. The plague did not respect faith, only flesh. Along the caravan towns of Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar, the rhythm of trade faltered. Merchants who had once carried porcelain from China, gems from India, and manuscripts from Persia found their goods lying idle in storerooms. A caravan might depart with 50 men and arrive with 20. Travelers whispered that the desert itself had grown hostile, not with bandits, but with unseen spirits that clung to breath and bone. Dynasties were shaken. Some rulers, faced with declining revenues and empty treasuries, sought harsher taxes, only to find fewer subjects left to bear them. Others turned inward, building gardens, shrines, or resting places for the dead, as though to leave at least a trace of beauty against the tide of loss. Yet even in the midst of devastation, resilience showed itself. Local healers offered remedies of herbs, resins, and smoke. Astrologers charted the heavens, searching for signs that the dark influence of the stars would soon pass. Poets, too, captured the feeling of suspended time, when the roads were empty, the markets silent, and the world seemed to hold its breath. And still, life endured. Caravans resumed, though smaller. Cities revived, though changed. The same roads that carried death also carried renewal. For across India and Central Asia, plague was not only a destroyer, it was a sculptor, reshaping the flow of trade, bending dynasties, and etching into memory the fragility of empires. The plagues of China, dynasties unraveled. In the long history of China, the mandate of heaven was often said to shift with the winds of disaster. Floods, famine, rebellion, and plague. When pestilence struck, it was not only bodies that withered, but dynasties. The Tang dynasty, that great age of poetry and painted scrolls, saw its rhythms disturbed by waves of sickness. Records tell of swollen deaths in the capital, Chang'an, where streets fell silent, and markets that once bustled with silk merchants and storytellers became hushed. Court physicians prescribed remedies of ginger, ginseng, and incense, while Buddhist monks lit lamps for the departed. Yet behind the temple walls, fear lingered, whispering that perhaps heaven itself had grown displeased. Later, during the waning of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Empire's rule over China, the Black Death found fertile ground. Traveling along the same routes that carried the empire's wealth, plague carved through towns and farmlands. Grain stores lay untouched as entire families perished. The strength of Mongol rule, already stretched thin, faltered under the weight of empty fields and shrinking armies. In the Ming dynasty, too, waves of plague returned. Beijing, the proud northern capital, endured outbreaks where tens of thousands died within a single season. Diaries from the time speak of corpses left unburied for days, of doctors who themselves became the sick, and of families sealing themselves indoors, waiting for the sound of coughs to fade outside their walls. Yet in China, as elsewhere, the story was not solely of death. Each calamity gave rise to invention and reform. The state expanded granaries, established better local administration, and sought to regulate the movement of goods and people, hoping to catch pestilence at the borders of provinces. Medical texts multiplied, recording symptoms, treatments, and even the superstitions of the age, so that later generations might learn from the sorrow. Plague tested dynasties, and more than once, it helped topple them. Yet it also compelled renewal, ensuring that the rhythm of Chinese history was not only one of collapse, but of rebuilding. The empire endured, reshaped again and again, as though heaven itself demanded resilience through suffering. Japan and the islands of the East. Across the seas, in the islands of Japan, plagues did not arrive with the same thunderous devastation as in China or Europe, yet they left their mark all the same. The Heian period, famed for its delicate poetry and courtly refinement, was also a time when pestilence visited the capital of Kyoto with unsettling regularity. The chronicles record that whole districts would suddenly grow quiet, their shutters closed, while carts carrying the dead rolled slowly to temple grounds. But Japan responded differently than many empires. Here, plague was not always seen as a mere illness of the body. It was thought of as a disturbance in the harmony between spirits and men. The kami, those divine presences within nature, could be angered. The restless dead might stir, spreading disease as punishment. To appease these unseen forces, rituals were held where priests chanted sutras, floated lanterns on rivers, or rang bells in hopes of cleansing the air of malice. The concept of Goryo, vengeful spirits, shaped much of the response. When a powerful figure died unjustly, and plague followed, it was often believed that their angry soul had returned to trouble the living. Temples were built, shrines erected, and elaborate rites performed to soothe the wandering dead. In this way, outbreaks were not only medical crises but spiritual reckonings, shaping both religion and politics. In later centuries, Japan's relative isolation during times of great global plague, such as the Black Death, spared it from the scale of devastation seen elsewhere. Yet epidemics still ebbed and flowed, carried by ships from China or Korea, or by local conditions of famine and poor harvest. The smallpox epidemic of the 8th century alone is said to have claimed a third of the population, shaking the early foundations of the imperial court. From the rice paddies to the mountain temples, plague in Japan was woven into the fabric of belief. It was not simply endured, but interpreted, each outbreak a message, each wave of fever a reminder that life was fragile, and that unseen worlds pressed close against the human one. The Indian subcontinent and the cycles of affliction. The Indian subcontinent, vast and varied in climate, was no stranger to the rhythm of plague. Long before the great medieval pandemics, texts in Sanskrit and Pali spoke of fevers that swept through villages, of coughs that lingered like curses, of skin eruptions that marked the afflicted. In the ancient Ayurvedic texts, disease was described not only in physical terms but as an imbalance of the humors, or dashas, wind, bile, and phlegm. Plague, in this framework, was a disruption of balance, a disorder that echoed in body, spirit, and society alike. Great empires of India, from the Mauryas to the Mughals, endured such waves. A famine would weaken the people, then disease would follow like a shadow, striking hardest at the poor, the laborer, the soldier far from home. Even the palaces were not immune, though kings often sought solace in rituals, processions, or the blessings of holy men. The belief that divine displeasure or cosmic imbalance caused plague was deeply rooted, and temples would resound with prayers whenever pestilence appeared. The port cities, Calicut, Surat, Bombay, were especially vulnerable. Merchants carried silks, spices, and jewels across the seas, but along with them came rats in the holds of ships, and with the rats, the old enemy, plague. In the 17th century, Surat was devastated by outbreaks so severe that foreign travelers wrote of streets emptied, of markets silenced, of corpses left unburied because no one remained to bury them. Trade faltered, and with it, the flow of wealth that had bound kingdoms together. Yet India's responses were not only ritual or fatalistic. Physicians, Vaidya and Hakim, experimented with treatments, herbs, oils, purges, diets adjusted to balance the humors. Whole communities organized around prevention, cleaning wells, burning incense thought to purify the air, or isolating the sick. And while not always successful, these methods represented a living tradition of medical thought that bridged the spiritual and the practical. For the subcontinent, plague was not a single catastrophic event, but a cycle, arriving, receding, returning again. And in those cycles, kingdoms were tested, trade was reshaped, and faith was both shaken and deepened. Each wave carved subtle changes into the long story of India, leaving behind memories of loss but also of resilience. Epilogue: The quiet echo of plagues. Across continents and centuries, the story has been the same. Plagues arrive like uninvited guests, reshaping cities, kingdoms, and empires. They whisper through crowded streets, silence marketplaces, and humble rulers who once thought themselves eternal. Yet in their wake, life always found a way forward. New laws written, new faiths born, new communities rebuilt upon the ashes of loss. The calm history of plagues is not only one of devastation, but of endurance. Empires fell, yes, but villages rose again. Rituals changed, but prayers continued. Knowledge deepened, carried forward by healers, scholars, and survivors who recorded what they saw so others might endure the next time. And perhaps that is the quiet truth. Plagues reshaped empires, but they also reshaped humanity itself, teaching fragility, resilience, and the ever-turning cycle of life and renewal.